The first question I have is, can you just describe how you first became interested in the Septuagint and in Septuagint studies and any training, if formal training, that you had in the discipline as a student?
Well, we did not speak Greek in high school, but we did have a very good background. I always say we were kind of trained like little professors
Hmm.
in our high school in Amsterdam, in the city where I was born. In our final year in high school, we did most of our studies in classical studies. That is 9 hours in Greek and 9 hours in Latin. It was completely crazy.
Hmm.
I enjoyed it very much, and this made me fit for uh, continuing my studies. But when I went to Israel in 1961, I really wanted to study Hebrew Bible, uh, only to find out that you cannot study Hebrew Bible alone, but you need a second major.
Hmm.
So I took a second major, the Greek literature, and so in the second year of my study, I started studying the Septuagint with Professor Leo Isaac Seligman, a very famous Septuagint scholar. It was an MA course, but I was allowed to be in there because I already had a good background. And the remainder of history, because from then onwards I specialized in the Septuagint. I took his course, which people normally take once. I took it 4 times.
Wow.
I did not write my MA thesis with him, but I wrote it with Professor Shmayahu Talmon on the Septuagint of Jeremiah. Subsequently, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the Septuagint of Jeremiah. And I started publishing before I was 30 because a friend of mine said, you really, if you want to do something in scholarship, you have to start doing that before you're 30. And so my dissertation was accepted, I believe, in 74. And I had a certain development of interest in my work on the Septuagint. And then I had the usual academic career. When I came to Israel, I intended to be a high school teacher. That didn't work out because I was taken aside by Professor Talmon as his assistant, and then I started an academic career.
I'm curious to know, since you were talking about your training in classics in your high school days, what was the position at the time that you were in your master's program of figures like Talmon and Seligman about the nature of the Greek of the Septuagint? This is obviously a very current discussion now over what sort of Greek it is, the nature of Koine. What was their views, if anything in particular, about the language of the Septuagint?
I would say Talmon didn't know much about that.
Hmm.
He was only interested in the variants. He was not a great specialist in the Septuagint. Seligman obviously was. I wouldn't say that he was a specialist in the area of what was the nature of the Septuagint language. I developed my own views. But from whom did I learn? I don't think I learned much from anyone in particular, but I did my own reading. It
Hmm.
wasn't until 1974 that I learned much about this. At that time, it was the late John William Weavers,
Hmm.
who at that time asked me, a young Septuagint scholar, to prepare a Septuagint lexicon. That never came about.
Hmm.
but I prepared myself for 1 year on Septuagint lexicography, and I started a project as a Vorstudien for a lexicon, and that project later became the so-called CATS project,
Hmm.
Computer Assisted Tools for Septuagint Studies. It was to be the first step towards a lexicon. I realized that I didn't know enough for making a lexicon, and I thought then, and I still think, that is a project for not for one person, but for 3, 4, or 5 persons.
Hmm.
And then at that time, I developed some views on the language of the Septuagint as being a translation language, indeed. And I did not really learn much about that. Well, actually, I learned some things in Oxford because that was the year I had a sabbatical. I don't know, was a sabbatical or a year of, now they would call it postdoc in Oxford. And I took courses with G.W. Kilpatrick, a New Testament scholar, a very fine scholar. And I learned much from him, and he did have his views on the New Testament Greek, on Septuagint Greek, and yes, that helped me. It is really translation Greek. It's not the language of the Holy Spirit as they thought until maybe 1850 or so.
Right.
It is the language that was to some extent influenced by papyri, as Dijsman said, but more than anything else, it is translation Greek. Well, the book that you refer to is really called The Text Critical Use of the Septuagint in Biblical Research.
Hmm.
That now, half a year ago, made it to its third edition with Eisenbrauns, after having been dormant for maybe 10 or so, more than 10 years, maybe 20 years. A major point in my development was my work for the Hebrew University Bible Project. That I joined in maybe the third year of my study as an undergraduate. The Hebrew University Bible Project, which still exists, was initiated by Professor Moshe Gershon-Gottstein, co-directed by Professors Talmon and Chaim Rabin, later on also co-directed by myself, and is geared to preparing an edition, a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible, without evaluations, incidentally, like the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia or Quinta. There I worked on the Septuagint and later on the first apparatus, including all the ancient versions. I learned how to treat, and I worked there on Isaiah and on Jeremiah. I learned how to treat the ancient evidence, how to see in parallel columns the Masoretic text and the Greek text. I developed ideas about what we then called phenomena in the translation technique. I developed ideas about the importance of translation technique, about systematic approach. We had little index cards about each phenomenon, such as a plus of a pronoun, a minus of a pronoun, change in number. So a systematic way of viewing the differences, as laid out by our boss, Professor Goshen, where I myself, as a youngster, took part in development of that system. And that led into the development of that book that you mentioned. and
Okay.
which was also the basis for the courses I gave at the University, the annual courses for on the Septuagint, each year a different book. Courses that I have given maybe 35 years at the university, and that were instrumental in my development as a Septuagint scholar. I always say, and I will continue saying, if you deal in textual criticism, it's not enough to be a good scholar and to read and to be clever and to read articles and to write good articles. You have to do the what we call in Hebrew the black work, the labor work, or maybe in English called the nitty gritty.
Yeah.
Have to do the work on a daily basis, on a chapter, on a book, for at least 1 year, preferably 2 or 3 years, because if you don't feel the work on a daily basis, you are really not sufficiently a textual scholar.
Hmm.
And even some of my colleagues who are established scholars have not gone through this process of doing this detailed work. They have not sat in such courses. And this is what we at the Hebrew University were able to do, and this is what developed my own views. Very rarely you find this outside of Israel in courses. I mean, at a developed level. We have here between 10 and 15 people each year who are very good, obviously, in Hebrew, and also very good in Greek, and who can do that. And so this is the basis for our textual work. I say this with much pleasure because in this way, if I gave a course on the Septuagint of Genesis, as I've now done twice, and recently, say 3-4 years ago, I was able in that year to produce 3-4 articles on the Septuagint of Genesis, etc., which otherwise I would not have been, I could have done it, but I would not have been able to do because I found, and this is also interesting to say, that my students are better critics than my colleagues. Students are more cruel. They say what they need to know, and I need to prepare myself for my classes.
Yeah.
Colleagues are more polite, and sometimes they know less. So having to give a course on the Septuagint of Genesis is a real good preparation for your work.
Yes.
Which would be equally good if you work, let's say, obviously, if you have to give a Septuagint, if you have to prepare the Septuagint of Samuel for the Göttingen Septuagint, that, of course, with students, that is equally good. But then you have to do the same work if you work on that with a few students. So you asked, what did I do? So I first worked in a Bible project, Hebrew University Bible project. Then I created this CATS project, which I started together with Robert A. Kraft at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was of great help, and he is of great help. And he knew then and even today still knows much more about computers than I do. And while the conceptual idea of laying out everything in 2 separate columns is mine, but the computer execution is his. How to do it, how to build the project, that is his idea. And I learned much from him. And so we had, let's say, 5-6 people working with us in Philadelphia. And then I brought the project to Jerusalem, where I had another 10 people. And so over the course of 10 years, we did this work, or lay out the parallels between the Hebrew and the Greek for the whole Septuagint. And this was actually dormant for maybe 5 years or so until we were able to incorporate this in the CATS database in the Accordance computer program.
Right.
First in the Macintosh and now also in the PC environment.
Yep. And that's also available in the BibleWorks program as well.
And then it came in the BibleWorks, and then it came in Logos, where they, in both of which, they found a good house, a good environment. The facilities of the program are still better in Accordance, but in all three of them, they find a very good environment. In Logos, particularly interesting because they're not vertical, but they're horizontal, which has many good fringe benefits. And this developed the students, the readers, the users very much. So that was my second project. And let me see. Well, I worked on other, I work on the Septuagint all the time. Then, of course, there was an interregnum of many years of work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, during the course of which I also continued my work on the Septuagint, but on a slower pace. And now maybe I do more work on the Septuagint, not any particular project. I publish one small text now. What shall we say? But this topic and that topic, and I'm doing abstract work, or I'm on the now on the Torah, on the Pentateuch, the whole development of the text of the Torah. So the Septuagint is just one part of it.
Sure.
And so it all comes together. And so that's my next book will be the textual development of the Pentateuch. On the whole, I would say I've been coming to conferences from 69 or 70 onwards, and the creation of the IOSCS has made a major difference for the field. International Organization for Septuagint and Cognate Studies started, I think, in 1969, but possibly in 1970 or possibly 1971, by Harry M. Orlinsky as a one-man project. It may well be that the first meeting was in Los Angeles, California. He started this organization and then left it because he then was more involved in the International Organization for Masoretic Studies, but he did a great job. He took a group. I was a youngster. I still was a graduate student, but he invited me. And so I took this big trip from Jerusalem to Los Angeles. And he took a group of enthusiastic Septuagint students, including the older people, like weavers and Soysel and Soininen. And by the virtue of us meeting, maybe in the beginning every 3 years, but afterwards every year, we had to prepare papers, and that developed the whole field, because you have to do something.
Right.
On the whole, every subfield of Septuagint studies developed. translation technique, editorial technique, editions, all the secondary translations, Vetus Latina, the Syriac translations, in recent years, very much the Ethiopic translations, Armenian translations, now the Georgian translations, all of them are flourishing in research. Some of them still existing only in manuscripts, others already in editions. The Septuagint as a language in connection with papyri, a new lexicon by Muraoka,
Right.
Scholarship in Germany and also in English with the Net translation. In Germany, the Septuaginta Deutsch and the Erläuterungen. So 2 fat volumes.
Yeah.
And now with the introduction being planned, a very big, I think, 7-volume handbook being planned.
The first volume of which I think will come out in the next year.
Okay. So I think I have a piece, if that's the first volume, because I've seen proofs already. A book in England by Atkes with introductions to each of the books of the Septuagint. My own project, the Textual History of the Bible, which is an encyclopedia of textual criticism, together with Armin Lange as editor-in-chief, published 3 months ago by Brill, 2,000 pages. And I'm sure I forgot many things, but there's an enormous amount of tools,
Yes.
of text. Are there new texts that have been published? I'm sure there have been new texts. I can't think of anything right now. Oh yes, like Christine de Troyer has editions of Leviticus, of Joshua. I'm sure I forgot major things, but there's an enormous amount of tools, of books, of studies, of programs, and this all happened basically in the last 50 years, or a little less than 50 years. Now, I don't know right now, but I think everything in textual studies, not just the Septuagint, but, and I think rightly so, because partly because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is of major importance for the study of the Hebrew Bible, but not only of the Hebrew Bible. It's very important. Rightly so, and we are still dealing with new things, new developments. So every student of the Bible should take this all into consideration. And I'm still dreaming that we one day get new Bible editions, not just the Biblia Hebraica Quinta, but something beyond that. The whole field is moving. A recent dissertation has been written at Notre Dame on the final Exodus chapters. I haven't seen it yet. And if that is good or satisfactory, that may not be the first need, but for me that's the greatest riddle in Septuagint studies. So that's the tabernacle chapters.
Yes.
Ezekiel is still a riddle for me. So more work on the background of the Septuagint, on the language, and I've studied the issue of the origin of the Septuagint books, which is I've always thought that the Septuagint comes from Egypt, but this is not true. The first, the Torah probably comes from Egypt, but the default position for the other books should be Palestine. And this should be studied more. Well, I retired, as I said, 6 years ago. I've been teaching ever since. This is one of the opportunities we have in Israel. We have the right of teaching after we retire, without pay, of course. So I teach one course a year. So far, I think I've taught one course on the Septuagint. The other courses were on textual criticism. Maybe before too long I should return to teaching the Septuagint again. I've been guiding this THB project, Textual History of the Bible, and I've learned much from it. So that would be, let's say, the textual nature and textual history of Genesis, of Exodus, etc., on each of the books of the Bible, but also on the Targum, on the Pshita, etc. Then I've been involved in something non-Septuagintal, that is for an American group, the Green Scholars Initiative. I've been busy. Something parallel to the DJD, Discoveries in the Judean Desert. This group, the Museum of the Bible, owns 13 Dead Sea Scroll fragments, and so I headed a team, and we are now in the final stages of our work, and it should be printed within half a year. So that's a small edition of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. What else? And then I'm writing several articles on the Pentateuch, on the relation between the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch. I find that they are closely connected, even though you don't see it directly. I've written some papers on it. And I'm trying, but this is only the Pentateuch. And so if I may give my penny worth of wisdom, in the Pentateuch, the Torah, the Septuagint does not have the same value as in the other books. In the Pentateuch, the Septuagint is secondary, as a rule. It's popular. It's vulgar, full of harmonizations. And then this stops in Joshua. From where onwards there, it's more valuable. But there's always the odd exception, of course. The sky is the limit. There's so many unsolved questions. We have already very good editions in most books, and just continue interacting or combining the Septuagint studies with all the other ancient pieces of evidence for the Hebrew Bible. Those who want to connect it with the New Testament, with church fathers, Greek language. Yes, I think we've covered this with our earlier questions.